Betrayal does not come like a thunderclap. It builds up like a barely perceptible crack in a pane of glass that grows wider and deeper every day, until one day it all comes crashing down with a deafening crack. I, John Carter, always believed that Elizabeth and I had a strong marriage. We shared dreams, plans, memories. But it turns out I was blinded by that illusion, and one day everything I believed in came crashing down. That evening began like so many others, an ordinary company party where employees and their spouses were celebrating the successes of the year. Elizabeth was in her best dress, glowing with a smile, and I was proud to have this woman as my wife. But it turned out there was more behind her smile than I could have imagined. I remember walking slowly through the crowded hall with a glass of wine in my hand until I saw her. Her hands rested on the other man's shoulders, and his face was so close to hers. My heart sank as I realized what I was seeing. Instead of the familiar warmth, I felt an icy prick of betrayal that robbed me of my breath. When I left the hall, it was as if everything around me had lost its meaning. The noise of the party was a distant background. The faces of the guests blurred before my eyes, and my feet led me to my car. I got behind the wheel, but I didn't know where to go. Thoughts raced through my head. Why did she do it? Who is this man? How did I not notice it before? Elizabeth and I had been together for 12 years. Our marriage had its challenges, like everyone else's, but I never thought she was capable of such a thing. I remembered our happy moments, how we'd met, how we'd built our house together, how we'd rejoiced at the birth of our daughter. It all seemed like lies now. The next morning, I woke up on the couch in the living room. My head was splitting and everything inside was burning with anger and pain. Elizabeth was home. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red with tears. "John, please listen to me," she began, but I interrupted her abruptly. "Why? So you can lie to me again?" I was surprised at how cold and hard my voice was. Elizabeth began to tell me that it was a mistake, that she felt nothing for this man, that it was a moment of weakness. But every word she said only made my pain worse. How can betrayal be called a moment of weakness? I left, slamming the door, but her tears wouldn't leave my mind. Why was she crying? Was it because she was sorry I'd found out the truth, or because she was ashamed of her behavior? I got in my car, turned on the engine, and just drove, not knowing where I was going. The streets of the small town where I had lived most of my life seemed foreign to me. It seemed as if I no longer belonged to this place, this home, this family. My brain went back over and over again to the moment I had seen at the party. The memories were so vivid that I felt like I was reliving them. I stopped at a small park where Elizabeth and I had often walked in the early years of our marriage. She had laughed then, holding my hand, promising that we would be together forever. I closed my eyes, remembering the moment I'd asked her to marry me. It was right here in this park. I was holding the ring in my hand and nervous like a teenager. Her response was immediate and joyful, her eyes glowing with happiness. How could things have changed so much? I thought, looking at the empty driveway. It seemed as if the past and present had collided in this place. I felt cheated, but even more I felt broken. I couldn't go home. Not now. Instead, I went to my friend Mike, the only person I could confide in. He'd been my friend since high school, and we'd been through a lot together. When I knocked on his door, Mike looked surprised. "John, what are you doing here at this hour?" he asked, letting me inside. I sat down on the couch and put my head in my hands. "She cheated on me, Mike," I finally said. He was silent for a few seconds before he sat down next to me. "Are you sure?" he asked cautiously. I told him everything, how I'd seen her with another man, how she'd tried to justify herself, how I felt now. Mike listened in silence, his face growing darker and darker. "It's hard, John. I don't even know what to say. Did you talk to her after that?" She tried to explain herself, but I couldn't believe her. Every word she said seemed like a lie. Mike sighed and, hesitating, replied, "You have to decide what's more important to you. You can try to figure it out and see if you have a future, or—" He fell silent, not wanting to state the obvious. "Or I have to leave," I finished for him. The next few days were a blur. I came home late, avoided talking to Elizabeth, and she did everything she could to keep our family together. She called me, texted me, left notes on the kitchen table, but I couldn't bring myself to answer her. Every time I looked at her, I saw that scene, her smile, her hands on another man's shoulders. I couldn't get rid of that image. One night when I got home late again, I found her sitting on the couch with an album in her hands. It was our family album. She silently handed it to me. "John, look at us. Look at what we've built together. Please don't ruin it over one mistake," she said, her voice shaking. I opened the album and started flipping through the pages. Our pictures, our wedding, the birth of our daughter, holidays, traveling. Each picture told the story of our love, but it all seemed empty to me now. You ruined it, Elizabeth, I said, closing the album. I don't know if I can forgive you. She cried, but I couldn't comfort her anymore. Instead, I went into the bedroom, leaving her alone. The next day, I tried to distract myself from thoughts of Elizabeth by immersing myself in my work. But it was no use. It seemed that every email, every phone call, and even casual conversations with coworkers somehow brought me back to what had happened. I was trapped in my own thoughts. On my lunch break, I couldn't take it anymore and went out for a walk. The moment I had seen her with someone else was replaying over and over in my mind. I tried to figure out exactly when things had gone wrong. We'd been together for almost 10 years. We had a house, a daughter, everything seemed perfect. But I guess I was wrong. Memories began to pop into my head. The first year of marriage, how we decorated our house together, how she laughed, slathering me with paint as we painted the walls. That day we found out we were going to be parents. She hugged me, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely happy. But then came little things that I hadn't noticed or ignored before. Her phone calls that she would rush to end when I entered the room. The evenings when she'd tell me she was running late at work. It all took on a new meaning now. When I got home that evening, Elizabeth was waiting for me. Her eyes were red from crying. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in front of her that she had never taken a sip of. "We need to talk, John," she said when I came in. "Talk," I replied coldly, not sitting down. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I know I betrayed you. I know you hate me for it. But please give me a chance to explain myself." "Explain yourself?" I grinned, crossing my arms over my chest. "Explain why you chose to destroy everything we've built together. Why do I have to listen to this?" Her voice shook, but she continued. "It's not an excuse, but I felt alone, John. You were busy all the time, working all the time. I tried to get your attention, but you wouldn't notice." "So it's my fault?" I interrupted her. "Are you saying it's all my fault?" "No!" she exclaimed. "I don't want to put the blame on you. It was my mistake, but I just want you to understand why it happened." "Why did it happen?" I asked, looking her straight in the eye. "It happened because you made a choice. You chose to betray me instead of talking to me." She burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. But it didn't affect me anymore. Later that night, I sat in the living room holding my phone. I could have called her, told her we needed time, or demanded a divorce. But instead, I just kept quiet. My friend Mike called me after hearing that I had been depressed for the past few days. "John, you need to sort yourself out. Don't rush into a decision, especially now when emotions are so strong," he said. I knew he was right, but there was an anger inside of me. I wanted Elizabeth to feel the same pain I felt. The next morning didn't start out any better. Elizabeth acted as if nothing had happened. She had made breakfast and was trying to smile when I walked into the kitchen. "I thought we could talk tonight when Lily is asleep," she said. "You don't have anything to say that I want to hear," I replied, sitting down at the table. Lily, our 6-year-old daughter, walked into the room, sleepy but with a smile on her face. Her innocence was the only thing that kept me from leaving immediately. "Daddy, will you take me to the park today?" she asked, sitting down next to me. I smiled at her, feeling my heart clench with pain. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, glancing at Elizabeth, who looked away, trying to hide her tears. That evening, I sat on the couch while Lily painted in her room. Elizabeth came over to me and sat down next to me. "John, I can't live like this," she said. "Please tell me what I can do to make it right." I looked at her, and in that moment I realized I didn't know if it could be fixed. "I don't know, Elizabeth. Maybe nothing." She started crying again, but I felt nothing but tiredness. The morning began with a heavy feeling on my soul. Despite Elizabeth's latest attempt to act like nothing had happened, I couldn't shake the bitterness. Her words, her apology, it all sounded hollow, like a memorized monologue. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my cup of coffee, wondering what to do next. As it turned out, the answer to that question came unexpectedly. On my lunch break, I got a call from Mike. "John, how are you?" he asked. "It's hard to say," I answered honestly. "Look, I was thinking maybe you should tell someone else about this. Like your sister Kate? She's always been a good judge of character. Maybe an outside perspective would help." "I've been thinking. Kate had always been close to me. She knew me better than anyone. Maybe her perspective would really help me find answers." That same night, I called Kate. She knew something was wrong right away, even from my one hello. "John, what's wrong?" she asked, not waiting for my explanation. I sighed, gathering my thoughts. Elizabeth, she cheated on me. Kate was silent for a few moments. Oh, John, I'm so sorry. How did you find out? I told her everything from the moment I saw them at that party. She listened without interrupting. Did you talk to her? She asked me when I was done. Yes, but I'm not sure I can trust her after that. It's hard, John, but it's important to figure out what you want to do next. Are you willing to try to forgive her, or do you want to call it a day? I don't know, Kate. I feel like I've lost the woman I loved. Kate was silent for a moment, then added quietly, maybe you didn't lose her, but the illusion you created. Her words cut to the heart of the matter. Over the next few days, I began to notice more of the things I had ignored before. Elizabeth was really trying to mend the relationship. She was trying to be attentive, caring, but I couldn't understand. Was it sincere, or was it just an attempt to make amends? Lily seemed to sense the tension between us. She often asked questions like, "Why do you smile so rarely, Daddy?" Or, "Why does Mommy cry at night?" These words were breaking me from the inside out. One night, when Lily was already asleep, Elizabeth came up to me. "John, I made an appointment for counseling. I think it will help us if you agree to come." I looked at her and nodded silently. In the first session, the psychologist started with a simple question. "What do you want out of your relationship?" Elizabeth, without hesitation, answered, "I want to make things right." When it was my turn, I wondered. "I want to see if I can trust her again," I finally answered. The session lasted an hour, but it seemed like an eternity. The psychologist suggested that we try to remember moments when our relationship had been happy. Elizabeth started first. "I remember when we went on a trip for our first anniversary. You rented a little lakeside cabin back then. It was the best vacation of my life. I remembered that day. We were really happy. But the memories of what happened afterwards still overshadowed the joy. Meanwhile, I began to plan. It was more than just deciding what to do about Elizabeth. It was a plan to tell the truth to those who were important to us. I didn't want to do it out of revenge, but I felt it was necessary. One night, while Elizabeth was in counseling, I met Mike at a bar. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked when I told him my plan. "I'm not sure I want to," I replied, "but I'm sure I should." Mike nodded, probably realizing that I was serious. Soon I began to put my plan into action. I invited our friends and family over for dinner at our house. Elizabeth was delighted. She thought it was my way of showing that I was ready to move on, but that wasn't the case for me. The dinner was to be the culmination of all my thoughts, fears, and plans. I had meticulously thought out every detail. Elizabeth, unsuspecting, was happily engaged in the preparations. She decorated the house, prepared exquisite meals, and asked me several times if everything was going the way I wanted it to. I only nodded, holding back mixed feelings. Lily ran around helping her mother, and her joyful laughter was the only bright spot that evening. As the guests began to gather, the atmosphere in the house filled with a familiar warmth. Everyone was talking, laughing, reminiscing about old times. Elizabeth was radiant, as if everything was as it should be. But inside me, everything was burning. I felt like an outsider in this room, surrounded by people who knew nothing about the present state of our relationship. When everyone was seated at the table, I rose to make a toast. All eyes were on me, including Elizabeth's, full of hope and anticipation. I held the glass in my hand, but my fingers trembled. "I want to say a few words," I began, trying to stay calm. "Tonight is an opportunity for all of us to come together, to remember how important it is to value each other." Everyone smiled as they raised their glasses, but I continued. "But it's also an evening of truth, and I want to share something that has been on my heart for a long time." The room momentarily froze. I noticed Elizabeth tense up, her smile fading. "I thought I knew what happiness was," I continued. "I thought I had built the perfect family, but I've recently learned that it was all an illusion." Elizabeth opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. The guests began to look at each other, sensing something was wrong. "Elizabeth," I turned to her, "do you have anything to say?" Her face paled, but she still tried to take control of the situation. "John, what do you mean?" "You know what I mean," I replied. "That night at the party, I saw the whole thing." The room filled with whispers. Elizabeth tried to remain calm, but her eyes showed fear. "It was a misunderstanding," she began, but I interrupted her. "A misunderstanding? You call it a misunderstanding that I saw you kissing another man?" At that moment, Lily, who was sitting next to us, looked at us wide-eyed. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I knelt down beside her, trying to be as gentle as possible. "Lily, I want you to know that I will always love you, no matter what happens between Mom and me." She didn't answer anything, but I could see the tears in her eyes. The guests started to get up from the table, not knowing what to do. Some tried to calm the situation, others just stood there in shock. Elizabeth covered her face with her hands and cried. "I made a mistake, John," she said through her tears. "I made a mistake that I will never make again." But her words no longer meant anything to me. I realized it was the end. I turned to our friends and family. "I want you all to know the truth. I can't live a lie anymore." After saying those words, I left the room, leaving Elizabeth in tears and the guests in shock. It was the moment when I finally felt free from pain and deception. After I left that ill-fated evening, my feelings were mixed. I seemed to have broken free from the trap, but there was still a feeling of emptiness inside. I drove home, trying to get my thoughts in order. How could I have allowed myself to live in an illusion for so many years? Fragments of our marriage came to mind. The first years, full of love and understanding, our plans for the future, the joy when Lily was born. It had all seemed real, but now I wasn't sure any of it was true. When I got home, I sat down at the table with a cup of coffee. The room was quiet, with only the clock on the wall ticking away the seconds, as if to emphasize how quickly time was slipping away. My gaze fell on the family album on the shelf. I opened it, flipping through the pages that depicted moments of happiness. Elizabeth looked so sincere in those pictures. Lily, still small, sat on her lap, smiling into the camera. I couldn't understand how this could have turned into what I saw at the party. The next day, I decided to take action. It wasn't enough to just walk away and leave it at that. I felt I had to get justice, but not just for myself, but for Lily. She didn't deserve to live in a family built on deception. I started by contacting a lawyer. I needed to find out what rights I had, how I could protect my daughter's interests and myself. At the lawyer's office, I laid out everything that had happened. The man listened to me carefully, nodded, and suggested that I start collecting evidence. That evening, I decided to talk to Lily. It was hard for her to understand what was going on, but I knew she could sense the tension between Elizabeth and me. We sat on the couch, and I tried to explain everything to her without going into details. "Lily, sometimes adults make mistakes," I said. "But that doesn't mean they stop loving their children." She looked at me with sadness in her eyes and asked quietly, "Are you and Mom not going to live together anymore?" That question pierced me like a knife. I hugged her, trying to hold back the tears. "I don't know, sweetheart, but no matter what happens, I'll always be there for you." A few days later, I saw Elizabeth again. She tried to talk to me, apologizing, swearing it was all a mistake, but her words seemed empty. I looked at her and saw only the person who had betrayed me. "John," she said, "I realize what I did, but that was the only time. I swear I love you and we can fix this." "You love me?" I interjected, barely able to contain my anger. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done what you did." Her eyes filled with tears, but it didn't move me. I could feel my feelings for her dying. Soon I started preparing everything to expose her deception in front of her friends and family. This was necessary to show everyone who she really was. I started collecting evidence, correspondence, pictures, anything that could corroborate what I was saying. The process was painful, but I knew it had to be done. During this time, I also started spending more time with Lily. We took walks in the park, played at home, talked about everything in the world. I wanted her to feel my support and know that I would always be there for her. She was my main motivator during this difficult period. When everything was ready, I organized another get-together with friends and family. Elizabeth had no idea what I was planning. She thought it was an attempt at reconciliation, a chance to make things right. But for me, it was a moment of truth. The evening that was to be the climax of the whole thing came quickly. I invited our mutual friends, family members, and even some of Elizabeth's colleagues to a cozy restaurant. It was a place we had frequented together in past years, and it was the perfect place to set the stage. The atmosphere was cordial, people were chatting, joking, and Elizabeth was smiling as if unaware of what was waiting for her, keeping the conversation going. I watched her from afar, thinking over my words and actions. This moment was important not only for me, but for everyone present. It was to be the final line separating the past and the future. When everyone was seated at the long table, I rose from my seat, drawing the attention of the guests. "I'm glad you're all here," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, though I was seething inside. "I have something important to share with you today." Elizabeth looked at me with slight surprise, but her face remained calm. She seemed to think it was just another conciliatory speech. But what happened next made her smile disappear. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the big screen that was in the hall. All eyes turned there, and I pressed the play button. The video I showed was undeniable proof of her infidelity. It was moments I had collected over the past weeks. Correspondence with her lover, photos, videos taken that night at the party. At first, there was silence in the room. Then there were whispers, exclamations of surprise, and even indignation. Elizabeth sat as if petrified, her face pale and her eyes rounded. "Elizabeth," I said, turning to her, "I've been thinking about what to do for a long time. You've destroyed not only our marriage, but the trust we've built over the years." She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. "I'm not doing this for revenge," I continued. "I'm doing this so that everyone will know the truth. I can't live a lie anymore." As if on cue, friends and family began to turn away from her. Some left their seats, shocked by what they saw. Her closest friend, Sarah, came up to me and said, "John, I'm sorry you went through that. We were all deceived." Elizabeth stood up, her face red with shame and anger. "How could you?" she shouted. "You made it look like I was a monster." "Aren't I?" I answered calmly. "You chose this path for yourself." The evening ended quickly. Elizabeth left without saying goodbye, leaving nothing behind but emptiness. People were leaving, but now I felt free. I could finally get rid of the weight that was pulling me down. The weeks that followed were difficult, but I made it through. I hired a good lawyer to settle the divorce and custody issues with Lily. My daughter and I began a new life filled with peace and understanding. Elizabeth tried to contact me, but I didn't return her calls. The only thing I cared about was my daughter's future and making sure we were happy no matter what. This story taught me a lot. I realized that you can't let deception ruin your life. Sometimes you have to embrace the pain in order to free yourself from a toxic relationship and start living again. And I was willing to do whatever it took to make this new beginning the best it could be for Lily and me. Time passed, and life was slowly falling into its new direction. I couldn't say that everything went smoothly, but it was getting easier every day. The divorce was painful, but I was prepared for it. I hired an experienced attorney who helped me build a clear strategy. Elizabeth tried to challenge the terms of the agreement, but the evidence of her infidelity presented in court left little chance for her side. I fought for custody of Lily, and although it wasn't easy, the judge took my side. I provided all the evidence I could that I could provide a stable and loving environment for my daughter. Elizabeth had the right to see Lily, but our meetings were kept to a minimum. Every interaction with her reminded me of the betrayal, and I was careful not to bring up the past in her presence. Lily, though she was too young to understand the subtleties of what was happening, sensed the changes. She asked questions. Why Mom didn't live with us anymore? Why we didn't go to the park together anymore? I explained to her that sometimes adults make mistakes and that my mom and I had decided to live separately to make things better for everyone. Despite this, Lily and I found ways to brighten our days. We spent more time together, going to the zoo, riding bikes, watching her favorite cartoons. She became a source of joy and strength for me. Her laughter reminded me that life goes on and that I had to be strong for her. But it was impossible to forget Elizabeth completely. Sometimes I caught myself looking at old photographs or remembering moments when we were happy. At such times, I was overcome with a mixture of anger and sadness. I tried to understand how the person with whom I shared everything could so easily break our trust. One evening, a few months after the divorce, I happened to run into Elizabeth at the supermarket. She looked exhausted, and her eyes expressed uncertainty. She approached me as if she was about to say something important. "John, I wanted to apologize," she began. "I know I ruined everything. I lost my family, my friends, and most of all, I lost you." Her words sounded sincere, but I no longer felt the way I had before. "Elizabeth," I replied, remaining calm, "I have accepted that this is our reality. You have made your choice, and I have made mine. The only thing that matters to me right now is Lily." She nodded, realizing that there was no chance of getting the past back. After that meeting, I felt like I'd finally let go of everything that had bound us together. It was a strange moment, a mixture of release and the final point in our history. A new life was taking its course. I immersed myself in my work, devoted myself to raising Lily, and even began to think about opening my heart to someone new again. But this time I was sure I'd be more careful. This story taught me the value of honesty and trust. It showed me that sometimes loss is not the end, but the beginning of something new. And even though the path was thorny, I knew that it all made me stronger. I kept going, knowing that I had everything I needed to be happy: my daughter, my strength, and my faith in a better future. A few more months passed, and life started to become a little more predictable. I learned to live without the constant worry, without the constant pain that had haunted me throughout this time. Habits began to recover, new goals emerged, and I could finally feel like I could get back to normal. One of the most important changes was that I was finally able to put the past behind me. All this time I had been living with the feeling that I couldn't move on, that my life was ruined, but it turned out I was wrong. I realized that I don't need anyone to tell me how to live my life. I can control my own destiny. Lily got older and older, and I watched her grow up, her smile bringing me back to joy. We spent a lot of time together, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. I became a better father than I ever imagined I could be. She was my meaning, my center. I was beginning to feel that it was because of her sincere love, that I was able to start a new phase of my life. Time passed, and I began to discover the world again. I started to meet people. Sometimes I went on dates, but it wasn't that serious yet. I wasn't looking for instant solutions, and I wasn't in a hurry. I valued my independence, my solitude, which at some point became something new and important to me. But I wasn't alone anymore. I was with Lily. One day, when Lily had gone to bed, I sat down at the table and began to write. It wasn't an ordinary evening, not an ordinary day, but a moment when I suddenly realized how much I had experienced, how much I had changed, and most importantly, how much I had learned. I wrote a letter to myself. It was addressed to myself, as a reminder of what I had been through, how I had grown, and that now I could be the person I had always wanted to be. I wrote that I had no regrets about what had happened. I don't blame Elizabeth, although I still have a hard time forgiving her. I can't forget those painful moments, but I've learned that it's important not to forget, but to learn. I wrote about Lily, about her importance, about her being my fortress and my motivation. And most importantly, I wrote about the future, about the fact that everything is still ahead of me, that I can find love again, but only when I'm ready for it. I finished the letter, put it in my desk drawer, and in that moment, I felt the heaviness that had been weighing on my heart for so long begin to fall away. I was no longer the person who had been betrayed by love. I had become someone who could love truly, with an open heart and without fear. My life was mine alone, and I knew that at any moment I could start over. These lines, these experiences, were not just reflections on the past. They were an affirmation that I had learned to forgive, that I could trust again, that I believed in myself, and that only the best moments lay ahead of me. I finally believed that I would be happy and that I was capable of happiness.